Welcome to Lecture 4. Today's topic is Emergency Considerations, Part 1. We will be continuing with this topic in next week's lesson. So we will be looking at some emergency management operational issues. In other words, when an emergency takes place and an emergency that needs to be managed, what are the issues that need to be addressed beforehand? Now, between today's lesson and next week, we will be looking at direction and control, communications, life safety, property protection, community outreach, recovery and restoration, as well as administrative and logics. Today, however, we will be focusing on direction and control. Now, when you have any kind of emergency response or disaster response, you must have someone that is in charge of the entire operation. Because remember, emergency response is a massive undertaking, particularly if it is a large-scale emergency you have to deal with. So therefore, you must have a proper chain of command where every role is clearly defined so that there is no chaos and confusion. Because if you have chaos and confusion occurring during any emergency response, you are opening the door to secondary emergencies. So someone must be in charge of an emergency. And some of the things that they would be responsible for would be managing your resources, because every emergency will require several types of resources to deal with specific tasks. Management would also be required to analyze information coming into them. That information is going to be needed in order to understand the nature of the emergency and therefore to make wise decisions. So that would be the third responsibility, decision making. Now, what are some of the ways or mechanisms for managing any emergency? The first one we're going to look at is the Emergency Management Group, or EMG. Now, the EMG manages all incident related activities. So that is everything from collecting the information, gathering and organizing resources, planning, allocation of resources, and also to make decisions as to how the emergency response would be implemented. So it's quite a massive undertaking, as I mentioned. So the responsibilities of the emergency management group is quite broad. The emergency management group would also include as a participant the incident commander, or the IC. This is the person who will oversee the technical response. In other words, the actual implementation of the emergency response that has been already planned by the emergency management group. So the incident commander is a part of this group. Now, the EMG, or Emergency Management Group, is the immediate support for the incident commander. So the incident commander also sits on the incident command system. The emergency group, as I mentioned before, some of their functions would include allocation of resources. Of course, they would have to secure the resources as well. So they will have to determine what tasks get what resources. They would have to determine priorities, etc. They would be interfacing with the community, stakeholders, all stakeholders, community, media, outside response organizations, and regulatory agencies. So these are all different stakeholders that can either be affected by the emergency or would be participatory to the response measures. So the EMG is responsible for communicating and interfacing with them. Other emergency management group functions would include determination of short-term and long-term effects of an emergency. So remember, they are required to gather and analyze information. So they would have to make those judgments based on the information and analysis that they have collected. In other words, is the effects of the emergency short term? What would those effects be? What aspects of the emergency effects can be determined as long term? So they will make those decisions. They are also responsible for ordering evacuation of any community or facility, as well as shutdown. If it is a facility or an organization, they will make determination as to whether the operations need to be shut down as a result of the emergency. Now we mentioned the incident commander, and that the incident commander actually oversees the incident command system. That's the ICS. That was mentioned before with the emergency management group. They're responsible for the management of all incidents or all emergency related activities. The incident command system is responsible for the response or the implementation of the response that has been planned by the emergency management group. So an incident command system is a management concept designed specifically to allow responders to adopt an integrated organizational structure. So that's a clear chain of command equal to the complexity and demands of any single incident or multiple incidents without being hindered by jurisdictional boundaries. In other words, this structure would be a framework or clear guidelines within which the response would take place, and every organization and person being a part of that response would clearly know what they need to do and how it needs to be done. And as mentioned, the incident command system is not hindered by jurisdictional boundaries. So if the incident goes beyond a jurisdictional boundary from one region into another, there would likely be no obstacles in terms of response should you have an incident command system in place. So the incident command system was developed specifically for the fire services, but the principles have been applied to all types of emergencies and all scales of emergencies, whether it's within an organization or in a community or across communities. So the incident command system provides a framework or guidelines within which to coordinate emergency response, and as mentioned before, a clear chain of command and safe operations across jurisdictional boundaries. The incident command authority, what authority do they have? What activities or tasks do they carry out? The incident command system assumes command. They take charge of the emergency when an emergency occurs. They assess the situation. They determine what the hazards are, what the impacts are, and they also assess what kind of response needs to be carried out. The incident command system implements the emergency plan that has already been created by the emergency management group. As mentioned before, they determine the right response strategies which would have been planned ahead of time. Incident command system activates resources, so whatever resources had already been planned and allocated, they would activate and access those resources. If an evacuation is required, the ICS would order that evacuation and coordinate it. They oversee all incident response activities, so everything related to the response, the incident command system, and the entire team that's involved will oversee that. And they also declare that the incident is over. Right, so this particular structure, the ICS authority, they make a declaration as to when the incident is over and it is safe for all activities to return to normal. So here we have an example of an incident command system organizational chart. So this would not be the same for every ICS. However, it gives you an idea of what an incident command system structure would look like. At the very top we have our incident commander, So that's the individual who is in charge or coordinates the management of all the response activities. Remember, he also sits on the EMG. Under him, so these are examples for Trinidad and Tobago actually. Under him, you would find the planning section. You would find operations, logistics. So logistics would be all the details and planning that's necessary in order to ensure the implementation of the response. And then there is a finance section. So yes, we will need a finance section where you would have different units that participate in the financial aspects of the response, because everything costs money. All the resources, the organizing equipment, etc. The planning section, this is where all the planning would take place before the actual incident occurs. Operations, this would occur once the incident has occurred. Planning must go into this as well. For example, to organize your teams, strike teams, task force, etc. It all depends on the different emergencies that you're planning for. So this is an example of what your incident command system may look like. Right? So there would be several agencies involved and several departments from various agencies, depending on the scale of your incident command system. Now we also have what we call a unified command. A unified command is actually an incident command system that has been expanded to involve several ICS structures. So the scale of the incident command is much larger than that of an ICS. An ICS may, as I mentioned before, be within an organization or a community. However, an incident command system may be required if you have a large-scale incident. So they're useful to manage large-scale incidents. It is a structure that brings together the incident commanders of all major organizations involved in the incident in order to coordinate an effective response while at the same time carrying out their own jurisdictional responsibilities. So they are, each individual incident commander is responsible for his particular jurisdiction, whether it's a company or a community. However, they will work together in synchronicity in order to ensure that the emergency is contained and managed. And as I mentioned, this is used when incidents cross geographic and regional jurisdiction boundaries. Another mechanism that we would want to look at for emergency management is what we call an Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. Now this is actually a physical location that serves as a centralized management center for emergency operations. At this physical locations, decisions are made at the location on information provided by the incident commander. So remember, the incident commander and his team, the ICS team, they would be on the ground. They would be able to assess what is going on in terms of the emergency and what the needs are. Information would flow back to the EOC, and information would also be sent back to the incident commander. So the Emergency Operations Center serves as a centralized location to manage the flow of information. So during an emergency, information must be flowing both ways. The EOC will collect the information, the incident commander will forward information, and the incident commander would also disseminate instructions to the different teams within the ICS for emergency response. So the EOC would normally be located in an area of a facility or a community that is not likely to be involved in an incident, such as the security department in a company or a manager's office, or if it's in a community, it would have to be in a location that is not susceptible to some kind of hazard, regardless of the nature of the hazard, be it natural or man-made. This is an example of what an EOC might look like. So as I mentioned before, remember it's an information center. So you would find that there would be a lot of information technologies available here. See, we have a number of persons seated at computers, very engrossed in the work and tasks that they're doing. Here we also have a larger computer screen where information would be compiled. Notice they have maps as well. So in emergency situations, maps would often be utilized, particularly when you have large-scale emergencies. Other planning considerations that need to be developed in order to have effective direction and control. For example, you need to define the duties of personnel within an assigned role and establish procedures for carrying out those duties. So you not only define the duties, the actual duties of each individual, but you need to actually have guidelines for these individuals how to carry out their duties. So all of this has to happen up front. We can't wait until the incident happens in order to make these guidelines very clear. You also want to have determine lines of succession to ensure continuous leadership, authority, and responsibility in key positions. So in other words, you should always have a backup person to function in a particular role, especially key positions, because should an emergency occur and one of these persons not available, response still needs to be carried out. Someone needs to be available to take those decisions. You also need to determine equipment and supplies that would be needed for each response function. So remember, you have a wide number of hazards that could possibly occur in certain settings. You need to plan ahead of time for every hazard, every impact related to a hazard, and therefore each of those will require a particular type of response, which will require a certain type of equipment and other resources. Security. Security is also a necessary part of any emergency response. Oftentimes we would need to isolate the scene, and this would begin when the emergency is discovered. So this is the early part of the response. Any emergency response, you need to isolate the scene. The reason we do this is to ensure that no one is placed in danger to perform their duties. And you also want to ensure that no one from the outside inadvertently comes in and endangers themselves and the response teams as well. Some examples of isolation measures may include closing doors or windows. Remember, what you're trying to do is contain the hazard. You may want to establish temporary barriers after people have been safely evacuated. For example, when the emergency is on a larger scale, you would find you may find police security tape. That's that yellow tape you find they would use to bar off scenes of an incident. If it's an organization, you may want to use furniture as barriers. So these are just a few examples. Another example may be dropping containment materials in the path of leaking materials. So if you have maybe a chemical spill, for example, you would need to contain that spill. If you have maybe a fire, you would want to protect your files by closing filing cabinets, drawers, etc. So these are just a few examples of isolation measures. There would be many more. Coordination of outside response. Sometimes the emergency may require that the incident commander turn over operations to an outside response organization. So that's within an organizational setting. For example, maybe the fire services. What you will find sometimes is that the incident may the scale of the incident may be too much or beyond the ability of the skills of the incident command system to actually address. So an outside response agency may have to be called upon. Should that happen, you must have protocols in place, or in other words, guidelines as to how this should be done. So the protocols must be established beforehand and implemented between the facility and the outside response organizations. So there must be a clear guideline as to how this communication and the actual response would take place. So the incident command facility at your organization keeps track of organizations on the site and how the response is being coordinated. So in other words, the response is actually being carried out by an outside agency, but the incident command structure that you have on the facility, they are actually overseeing it. They must be fully aware of what is happening and also facilitating where necessary. So this helps increase personnel safety and accountability and helps to prevent duplication of efforts. At this point, I want to say thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please now proceed to the activities made available for this week. Thank you.